Welcome back to the Constitution Line by Line. I'm Senator Mike Lee, and today we'll be looking at Article 1, Section 7. As we get deeper into Article 1, the sections become a little more detailed than those that we've looked at so far. For that reason, we'll be covering Article 1, Section 7 in two parts. Part 1 will focus on the Origination Clause, which has been the source of some controversy in recent years. The text reads, quote, "All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills," close quote. Article 1, Section 7 outlines the process by which legislation is passed into law. The first clause, known as the Origination Clause, specifies that bills for raising revenue, in other words, bills amounting to an exercise in the power of taxation, must originate in the House of Representatives. Of course, in order to become a law, these bills will have to be approved by the Senate as well as signed into law by the President, but they still have to start in the House of Representatives. The Origination Clause was included in the Constitution for the purpose of making sure that the power of the purse, that is, the power to tax, must rest with the legislative body most closely accountable to the people, namely the House of Representatives. It was modeled after a similar provision in British law, under which the House of Commons was given preference over the House of Lords in matters of taxation. Remember, at the time this section was drafted, the Senate was elected by and meant to represent the state governments, while the House was supposed to answer directly to the citizens. This was changed by the 17th Amendment, providing for the direct election of senators, so that today it's harder to see a difference between the two houses, but the original conception was for the House and the Senate to play very distinct roles, and in some ways they still do. Taxation affects the people more than the states, as it's they who will ultimately have to pay for any government spending. So it makes sense that they should be more directly involved in the raising of revenue for the federal government than the states. Moreover, the state governments are already able to levy their own taxes. So giving the Senate the power of origination would have given the states an outsized voice in matters of taxation. The Origination Clause was part of a compromise to satisfy the more populous states during the drafting of the Constitution. Representatives from the larger states were worried that smaller states would have more power than was warranted by their population due to the fact that every state would receive 2 senators, regardless of their population. By vesting the power of taxation in the House of Representatives, the framers ensured that states with more people, and therefore more representatives, would have a larger voice in raising revenue. A further compromise was made in 1787, which allowed the Senate to propose amendments to revenue bills. Originally, the text provided that such bills originating in the House could not be altered by the Senate in any way. With the 17th Amendment blurring the distinction between House and Senate, some might argue that the Origination Clause has become vestigial and no longer relevant. On the other hand, each member of the House of Representatives still represents fewer people than senators like me who represent a whole state, and in that respect, the House remains closer to the will of the people. The clause still has judicial relevance. The words "for raising revenue" in the text of the Origination Clause are a little bit ambiguous, at least at the surface level. It's clear that tax increases fall under this category, but what about other bills that incidentally raise revenue without that being their main purpose? It's even been argued that a bill nominally decreasing tax rates could result in more tax revenue, and that this might count as a revenue bill under the Origination Clause. In United States v. Munoz-Flores in 1990, the Supreme Court held that a bill that creates and funds a new government program may originate in the Senate because that funding does not qualify as general government revenue under the Origination Clause. In 2012, the Origination Clause became an issue in the litigation involving the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which had originated in the Senate. Because the bill's individual mandate imposed a financial penalty on citizens for failing to purchase a health insurance plan, some argued that this could be construed as a tax increase. In fact, defenders of the law actually made this argument when the mandate was challenged as unconstitutional, as we'll see when we talk about the Commerce Clause in a later episode. Because the Origination Clause specifies that bills for raising revenue must originate in the House of Representatives, the Affordable Care Act was challenged in court on this basis. In NFIB versus Sebelius, the majority opinion upheld the law, and though not explicitly addressing the Origination Clause issue, implicitly supported the defense's argument that although the bill contained fines and penalties, it was not a revenue bill for purposes relevant to the Origination Clause. The Origination Clause is mentioned in the dissenting opinion, however, which reads in part, quote, "Taxes have never been popular, see e.g. the Stamp Act of 1765. So to sum up, the Origination Clause says that if you're going to raise taxes, you've got to do that in a bill that starts in the House of Representatives. The Senate can propose amendments, but the whole thing's got to start in the House. This is because the House of Representatives is the body within Congress that's most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. With other legislation, other bills can start in either the House or the Senate. They've got to pass both chambers in order to become law. But most of the time, it doesn't matter whether it starts in the House or the Senate. Bills raising taxes have to start in the House. That's the gist of the Origination Clause. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Constitution Line by Line.